Why don't we begin in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A reading from the book of Ruth. Boaz took Ruth. When they had come together as husband and wife, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not failed to provide for you today a redeemer. May he become famous in Israel. He will restore your family and be the support of your old age, for his mother is the daughter-in-law who loves you. She is worth more to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the boy, cradled him against her breast, and cared for him. The neighbor women joined the celebration, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, I think I hear buzzing. Is there buzzing?
Yes.
Okay, the problem is... Okay, is that better or worse? Okay, I know I don't have much of a voice. I don't know why. I was yelling at sinners and deacons and just out of control. So, continuing on with Ruth. The whole climax is that they had a son. And so Boaz and Ruth were married and they have this son. And the son is named Obed. And we discover it's the father of Jesse, the father of David. So that's a grandfather. These are the grandparents of King David. And the women of Bethlehem celebrates Naomi's joy because Naomi found a redeemer, a Goel, for her family. And they take the child and they place it in her bosom. And I have to say, I love that image of the grandmother cradling this baby. And Naomi, who, remember, her name is, she changed her name to Mary, who essentially came home with empty arms, now has in her arms this infant. And the son celebrates that both the past will be redeemed and the future will be redeemed. They say a son has been born to Naomi. Well, technically that's incorrect. Naomi's the grandmother. So what does that mean? It's the past has been redeemed. The child belongs to Naomi in the sense that the baby now redeems her husband who died, Ruth's husband who died, and it ends with this idea that the child, the boy himself, will be a Goel, and that from him one day a great king will be born, another Goel. So in this tender act is not adoption. Naomi now has a boy to replace the 2 sons that she lost. And I just love that. So it ends with this idea of mother and child back together. But the key part is that from this child will be born a great Goel, who once again will redeem the past and redeem the future. So it ends with this prophetic note. And you realize, at first, it's going to be King David. But then if you're Christian, you realize the Goel that will redeem the dead and save the future is who? Jesus, who also will be placed in the arms of a mother named Mary again. So it's kind of prophetic. Does that make sense? So that concludes our book of Ruth. Seriously, it does. So now I just want to switch to why I love the book of Ruth. Like, I actually love the book of Jonah because of its criticisms. But I love the book of Ruth for other reasons. One is that after it mentions this child, it does a genealogy. And the first thing I like is actually that the genealogy has in it these scandalous women. Seriously. The book concludes with this appendix tracing the Davidic genealogy all the way back to Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And then continues on down through Obed to King David. So it mentions these scandalous women. So I just want to go over that. And Ruth is a scandalous woman. Tamar, I think I told the evening classes, but do you guys know who Tamar is? Okay, so Tamar, this is another Levirate marriage where Tamar is married to this guy and the guy dies. And then the next son, he is going to be this Goel and redeem his brother by impregnating Tamar. Does that make sense? But that son doesn't complete the marital act because he wants the money. And so God kills him, or lets him die. And at that point, Judah is like, I'm not wasting any more sons on this woman. So it's Tamar's right to have a son, but Judah won't allow it. Judah's the father. And she does this most bizarre thing in the Bible. She wants a son to carry on her husband's name. And Judah basically strings her along saying, sure, eventually. But he really forbids it. So it's a bizarre story where Tamar, she dresses up as a prostitute. And she knows when Judah is going to be going to market. And she gets in a crossroads and she disguises herself as a prostitute. And then she sleeps with Judah and becomes pregnant. But as a prostitute, she made sure he didn't have anything to pair with. So he says, well, I'll give you a goat. And by the way, it's always a goat. No, it really is. It symbolizes deception. And if you're wondering, well, what do you mean? Well, how did Jacob deceive his father? He took goat hair. Does that? If you notice over and over again, a goat symbolizes deception. So anyhow, it comes up in the same thing. And Judah says, I'll give you a goat eventually. And she says, oh, no. I'm a businesswoman. So she said, give me your cloak and your signet ring and your staff. So basically, he gives her a credit card. And then he goes on his way, but then when he wants to retrieve him, the prostitute is no longer there. Tamar's gone. So then he finds out that Tamar is pregnant, which means she must have committed fornication. So Judah orders her to be burned at the stake. Because, that's what we should do. I'm sorry, I follow the Bible. So, hey, you're getting ahead. So, Judah, head of the clan, thinks that she should be burned at the stake. So they bring her in, and Tamar says, yeah, sure. Just one thing. Do you recognize these? And she pulls out the cloak and the signet ring and the staff. And this is, okay, so isn't that clever? So, but here's the twist. Judah sees it and says, you are more righteous than me. And Judah doesn't get defensive. He realizes he's been caught. And he realizes, yes, she did break the law of God. She dressed up as a prostitute. She broke the law of God, but she fulfilled the will of God. Does that make sense? So Judah proclaims that she is righteous, not him. He admits it, which is really quite brave of him as well. So usually in these genealogies, they don't mention women. But by the way, what does the signet ring, the cloak, and the staff symbolize? Which person has all three of those? Well, a king, yes. So this is the line of David, the greatest king of Israel. It also symbolizes Christ as really the ultimate king. But they came from Tamar. So Tamar disobeys God the law of God, but fulfills the will of God. And she's another one who the dead were dead, and it's actually through a woman that the dead are redeemed. And what looked like a curse actually turns out to be righteousness. This is a story of Naomi and Ruth as well. Ruth is a scandalous woman. She's a woman who converts to Judaism and becomes a hero. But technically, even in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, she is a cursed woman. She's not supposed to be married to a Jew. So the first four women named in Jesus' genealogy, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, they were Gentiles. All had some scandal, usually sexual, attached to their name. And the fifth woman in the Gospel of Matthew is Mary, who was Jewish, but she too has something scandalous tied to her name. She was found pregnant before marriage. So I love the fact that it comes out with the scandals, which really the point being is that we should just be honest about our scandals. No, seriously, in our family history, in the sense that I remember when I was ordained a priest. No, I take that back. Before I was ordained a priest, I tell you the story. One summer, my mother and I went to Al-Anon because my grandfather was an alcoholic. Great guy, great guy. But he was an alcoholic. And my mother came up with this idea as an indulgence. Why don't we go to Al-Anon together? So an indulgence is you're stopping the effects of a sin that's already been forgiven. So my grandfather was an alcoholic, that's a sin, but he was anointed and went to confession before he died, so the sin is forgiven, but the effects remain. So my mother and I are the effects of that. So as an honor to my grandfather, we went to Al-Anon. Does that make sense? So anyhow, I get called from the diocese, and this nun who works at the diocese said, just to let you know, some priests are upset that you're going to Al-Anon. They think it's scandalous. And I know I was kind of like, well, why would that be a scandal? I mean, just honestly, it is what it is. And if they think that's a scandal, you really shouldn't look too closely into my life. And it's a minor point, but I love how in the Bible we do, the Jews at least, they're honest about it. Or, give you another example. There's a guy in our parish who, his mother was divorced, and his mother got divorced, and this is years ago. His older brother wants to become a priest, but they didn't allow him to become a priest in Chicago because how can you have a priest whose mother was divorced? So he had to go to the Diocese of San Diego because that would have been too scandalous. Of all the things going on in Chicago, I don't think that would have been the most scandalous. But so the other one is Rahab. Do you guys know the story of Rahab? So Rahab, before Israel, the people enter into the promised land in Canaan, Joshua sends 2 scouts across the River Jordan to figure out what's going on in that country. And they especially want to scout out Jericho, that's a major city they're going to come into. So these spies entered Jericho and went to the house of prostitution, where Rahab was a prostitute. And Rahab is mentioned as a prostitute multiple times. In fact, you know how they keep repeating Ruth the Moabite? It's Rahab the prostitute. Like, how would you like to be saddled with that your entire life? Now, it may seem strange that the spies found refuge in a house of prostitution. That's scandalous. They're the people of God. But if you were a spy, the house of a harlot would probably be a good place to go to avoid detection, because travelers often entered such houses, and it wouldn't be suspicious. Does that make sense? Now, also, Rahab's house was against the city wall, so it provides an easy escape. But here's the odd part. So they go to this house of prostitution where Rahab is, and Rahab converts to Judaism. She, like her name, Rahab, you can hear Ra, H-R, that's the name of Egyptian god. And as an Amorite, Rahab would have belonged to an idolatrous people, just as Ruth did. But she meets God's chosen people, and she gives up her sinful way and converts to Judaism. And then she becomes Jewish and marries Solomon, who they have a son. And this is, remember, hundreds of years before Ruth. Guess what they named the son? Boaz. Now, it's not the Boaz that married Ruth, but you have kind of this similar pattern going on. So in Ruth, we see these themes of conversion, of sinners meeting God's people, and then coming to believe in God. So the repeated pattern of Boaz. So it's God's people who are supposed to meet the scandalous, the sinners of the world, and we're supposed to convert them. Our way of life is supposed to impress them. So in the Gospel of Matthew, it mentions all 5 women, the last one being Mary, and there's something scandalous about all the women. All 5 were breakers of the law, but actually end up doing the will of God, Rahab as well. The women are bold and strong, and scholars call these breakout stories because you'll have a story and then you'll break out. And usually the breakout story has something to do with morality, and it's the opposite of the dominant theme. Like the normal theme would be, these spies go into the city and they find a saint. Does that make sense? Like you'd think it would work like that, but they go into the city and they find the worst sinner, and that person is converted. So think about this. It's about conversion. The Jonah story is the opposite. Jonah is rigidly religious. He follows the law. But the twist is, he follows the law, but doesn't do the will of God. You remember that, right? These women do the opposite. They are breakers of the law who does the will of God. And so the one who thinks he's so orthodox, Jonah, is not doing the will of God, and yet the 5 women, they're scandalous, and they do the will of God. And I just mention it because, people complain about my homilies all the time, probably with good reason. But, and this irritates me. So somebody who's not from our parish is visiting Holy Apostles, and it's, and it happens many times throughout the year, that the first reading, what's going on in the first reading is the very opposite of what's going on in the gospel. And I forget that, I think this one was the lepers, because it happens in this cycle, where the first reading is how to treat lepers, and it's cruel. You're not allowed to talk to them, you're not allowed to feed them, you're not allowed to touch them, and if you are, then we will turn our backs on you. And so Jesus, the leper, comes, and the leper speaks to Jesus, and Jesus speaks to him, breaks the law. Jesus touches the leper, which breaks the law. So just in the homily, I said, we don't follow the entire Bible. It's so obvious. There are literally hundreds of laws. Everybody here is breaking all at once. Men and women shouldn't be seated together. A man can't sit in the same chair as a woman. Do you know how many times at Mass you probably have broken that law? Anyhow, so I said, Christ is bringing us to a different morality. We're called to a higher morality than just following the rules of the Old Testament. So I got, that weekend, 2 complaints. And so the diocese calls me and says, did you tell people that they don't have to follow the Old Testament? Yeah. And the person who's talking to me doesn't even have a college degree. They don't even have a degree in theology. I have at least 3. And I said, yeah, I did. And I said, well, could you give me your sources? Really? You couldn't figure this one out on your own? And I get the fear. I get the fear that if we start breaking laws, then where do we end up at? You know, it's Saturday night in Sioux City. But, so, like, if you start, but there is this theme, and that's what I like about the scandalous women in Ruth. They broke the law of God and saved the people of God. They broke the law of God, Mary does too, and yet they're the ones who redeem the people. The other thing I like is the most common reference to God, and this fits the scandalous women. The most common reference to God in Ruth is Yahweh, but also they keep calling God El Shaddai. So now that itself is a little bit scandalous. Not really, but do you know what El Shaddai means? El means God. Like the name Gabriel, any name that ends on E-L, that's a Hebrew word for God. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Anyhow, I just realized the first two letters of my name are the opposite of God. So I wonder what that means. So El means God. Shaddai, it means two things in English. So it can mean either mountain, like the mountain of God. So you could say, and Hebrew works by concrete images. It's different. It's the opposite of Greek. Everything's a concrete image. So God on a mountain, we translate that in English as all-powerful God. Does that make sense? Because that's a powerful image. But Shaddai not only means mountain, it means breasts, as in like a boob. And what that symbolizes is, all-nourishing God is how you translate it. God of life. As a baby gets life from the mother. Does that make sense? So I just think it's amazing. The last image is Naomi cradling her to her bosom. And it keeps repeating the word El Shaddai. Don't you love that? So I love, just the first reason I love Ruth is because of the scandalous women. They're the ones who actually give nurture and do the will of God, but break the will of God. The second reason I love Ruth is just the idea of the theme of evangelization and conversion. It's so obvious. Like Jonah, he's supposed to convert the world, but he doesn't. His idea of religion is that we get to hate those people over there. Ruth is one of the hated people and converts, and in the line of David and Jesus. And how does Ruth convert? Why does she convert? Because she falls in love with Naomi. She falls in love with the people of God. And Naomi is her mentor. So in the Old Testament and New Testament, it suggests this idea that you need mentors in your life. You need examples to follow. Ruth is a convert to Judaism because of her mentor, Naomi. And older people are supposed to be a mentor to the younger generation. Gives them something to strive for. That's why in Catholicism, when you get baptized or confirmed, you always have a sponsor, a godparent. They're supposed to inspire the child. Ruth is a symbol of those who are evangelized. Jonah is a symbol of those who call themselves religious, but refuse to evangelize. So Jonah is only for Jonah. So I love this. And liturgically, if you are Jewish, remember, the Jews have 7 feasts. It's always 7. When is the book of Ruth read liturgically? On what feast? The book of, that didn't go anywhere. It's Shavuot, also called the Feast of Weeks. You know what we call that in Greek? It's the Feast of Pentecost. When 50 days after the Passover, Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments. For us, 50 days after Christ's Passover, the Holy Spirit comes down. For us, it symbolizes the new law is not rules and regulations. The new law is the fire of God's love. And so tradition, it's read on the second day. And when did Ruth and Boaz meet? It was on the feast of the barley harvest, which is when Shavuot happens. But that's not why it's read. It's not a feast that you just make a commitment to God. Shavuot is also where you vow, yes, a morality. You make a vow to God about a morality, but also to be committed to the Jewish people. Judaism is a communal religion. Catholicism is a communal religion. You make a commitment to a community. We don't go to God alone. You do not find God alone. You find it in and with and through others. Ruth becomes Jewish through falling in love with the people of God. Now, modern Christianity, mostly Protestantism, is not communal. It's individualistic. Worse, sometimes it's even tribal. But there's no commitment to a people. There is this historic change. When Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, if you break away from the Catholic Church, you have to create this theology that, well, we don't need a whole institution. We don't need all these people. It's just you and the Bible and God. Does that make sense? So what Protestantism does is cut out a theology of the community. It's just you and God, and then you call yourself spiritual. The Jews have this ancient feast where you actually make a commitment to be community. And so many times, Christians don't get this. That to make a commitment to God is to make a commitment to community. And how you get converted is through other people. So people ask the question, well, why can't I go to communion? I believe in the real presence, so why can't I go to communion? Well, does that make, because they can make a vow to God, but to receive communion is not only making a promise to God, not only making a promise to a morality, it's also a promise to be community. It's not about believing in the real presence. It's also about this loyalty that you have to this people that stretches back, clear back to Abraham. So why is Ruth read on the Feast of Pentecost? Because Ruth makes a commitment to a people before she makes a commitment to God. Ruth makes a vow to be community, and then she discovers God. Don't you love that? This is another image. When Moses receives the Ten Commandments, the shofar, this ram's horn, is blown. And if you read the Torah, it has a really bizarre explanation where it says that the sound of the shofar got louder and louder as it left the mountain. Well, according to physics, that's impossible. So what is it trying to say? Sound gets softer the farther it goes. What does it say? Yes, community. The idea is that at Sinai, they hear the sound of the shofar that announces God's presence. It started there, and it didn't get softer. It actually got louder because it's carried by the people of God through time. As it travels into the world, the sound of God's presence gets louder because it's the people of God who are making it louder, not more dimmer. It gets louder and louder, announcing the presence of God. Naomi is magnifying the presence of God hundreds of years after Sinai. So that was done at the Feast of Pentecost, and Naomi is carrying on the feast. Carrying on the sound announcing God's presence. And just as an aside on this idea of evangelism, the idea is that I know you don't make it easy to become part of the people of God. You actually have to test people. And so it's part of Catholicism too. If you enter a monastery, what they're supposed to do according to the rules of the monastery is that if you apply, you have to get denied. And then you have to apply again. And then you get denied again. And the third time you apply, you get accepted. If you notice, that happens in the story. Naomi says to Ruth, no, go back to your people. She says it 3 times. And 3 times, Ruth says, no, I'm staying with you. You don't want people part of the people of God that are weak-willed. Does that make sense? So even monasteries keep this idea that, no, we're going to deny you 3 times. And if you don't have the grit, then shouldn't be part of this community. Isn't that bizarre? But if you notice, it happens in the book of Ruth, because the second reason I like the book of Ruth, it's about evangelization from a very strange angle. The third thing, and it's a little bizarre, is Ruth is a new Abraham. Who else besides Ruth is not born a Jew, but enters God's people? Abraham. Abraham is noted for his hesed, his loving kindness. Ruth twice is mentioned that she is a person of hesed, loving kindness. Naomi says it about the dead. Boaz says it about how faithful and hesed she is, kind she is. Abraham, third, Abraham is loyal to God. Abraham is the opposite of the Tower of Babel. The stories happen next to each other. The Tower of Babel is when human beings unite to make a name for themselves. Abraham isn't concerned about his own name, he's concerned about the name of God. So when Abraham enters a promised land, he keeps building altars and calling upon the name of God. Ruth is loyal to Naomi. She's loyal to the name of her deceased husband. Ruth wants his name to live on. She's not concerned about her own name. So there is the same Hebrew word pattern going on between Abraham and Ruth. I'm skipping all the Hebrew, but they're models of these loyalty. Both left their homeland and journeyed to the promised land. Abraham promises his descendants, one day there will be a great king. Ruth, she's a great-grandmother who also was promised that one day from her line would be a great king. Also, Abraham's family tree in Genesis mentions a Levirate marriage and this is, you have to reread it. Sarah and Abraham were a Levirate marriage. Ruth is a Levirate marriage to Boaz. Ruth and Abraham, it says, believes in a God of impossibilities. So the third reason why is that it's a repeat of the Abraham story. And my fourth reason I love Ruth, and this is my main one, I love the idea of a Goel, a redeemer. And a Goel, just to explain it again, a Goel, God makes some people different. Gives them different gifts. And one of the gifts is God makes some people a Goel. And a Goel is somebody who they're just made stronger. You know, there's just steel in them. And like, I'm not a Goel. I'm not that strong. I'm actually kind of a coward, truth be known. But like one of my friends, her name is Jean Fisher. Anybody know her? How do you know her?
You've talked about her.
Oh,
You
okay.
see her on the news all the time.
Well, that's true. She's one of my closest friends. And Jean Fisher I've known forever. And even as a little girl, she was a Goel. She was a little bit of a bully, truth be known. But so in high school, she always wanted to be a prosecutor. And like Jean is one of these people that is so intense. Like we used to joke, laser beams come out of her eyes. And even the cops, their nickname for her is Mean Jean. And because Mean Jean is, if she usually does child abuse cases, if you're in her courtroom, you are going down. She has a bad reputation. Now, in all honesty, she's an incredibly loving person. She's not mean. She's just intense about justice. Does that make sense? And from childhood, she would argue with her father about everything. From childhood, she wanted to be a prosecutor. I actually believe she is a Goel. So a Goel is somebody who, if you attack my family, or let's say if you attack me, you better watch out because My cousin's a goel. He'll beat you up. Does that make sense? A goel is somebody who defends the weak. Does that make sense? So, which angel is the most powerful goel? Michael. I'm like, even at one point, Gabriel is fighting this devil, and Gabriel, he's my angel, he's my favorite. Gabriel has to cry out to St. Michael to come and defend him. St. Michael is the most powerful. Or in the Bible, it says about God. God says, do not mock the poor, because I am their goel. So goel is a redeemer, but a goel not only is a kind of a fighter, but a goel can also redeem the dead. And I'll think about this. Orpha, in the story, she's married to a guy named Destruction. Ruth is married to a guy named Sickness. Well, there's a big difference, because Orpha, when she returns to her people, her husband's line is dead forever. Ruth's husband, his name is not dead or destruction, it's illness. So right then you have this hope that maybe he can come back. Does that make sense? And a goel had the power to redeem the dead. And here's the shocking part. In the story, there's 3 goels in this story. First is Boaz. He's literally called a goel. You can't miss it. And, Ruth decides, back in the story, Ruth decides to support Naomi. She goes out gleaning. Boaz sees her, orders his men not to harass her, tells her, you glean on my property because, Moabites are not well liked and the other gleaners could harass you. And when she comes home, Naomi says, well, this isn't gleaning, this is a harvest. Where were you doing it? And she's in a field of Boaz. And he says, oh, he's a goel. Now, there's also a connection between the goel and the land. God says 2 things to make sure that the poor and the rich don't become too divided. That God divides the land between all the tribes. And after 50 years, whatever the land exchanges, it returns back to the original families. It was to keep families together and to prevent excessive poverty. Actually, it wasn't really ever done, but it's called a Jubilee year. And a goel is the only protector who can restore people to their ancestral lands outside of that 50 years. So a goel can return people back to the promised land. Also, a Levirate marriage. They can raise up the dead. The reason why a lot of people don't, even in the Bible, want to be a goel is that if what child you have, that's going to cost me. Some of my children won't get such a great inheritance because it's going to go to your children. Does that make sense? So who would do that? Boaz. Boaz, he does redeem the dead. He pays the price for Ruth's family publicly. He makes sure it's at the city gates, and he literally, it costs him money to redeem Ruth. It costs him not money, but wealth. And this all points to Christ, who will also, quote unquote, pay the price to redeem the dead. Does that make sense? So a lot of times when you read in the New Testament that image of Christ paying the price, you kind of think like economics, like what? But like Boaz, paying the price means I'll pay everything to get you out of poverty. Who would marry a cursed woman? Deuteronomy says not to. But Ruth goes to Boaz and says, cover my feet. When she says cover me with your wings, yes, it means marriage, but he's really asking her to restore her family, to give her back her name, to return her to the ancestral lands, to give them back their inheritance. Boaz is the bridegroom who restores the dignity of one who's cursed, who gives up his own right to have children, who anyhow, you can see that Boaz is this image of Christ. Does that make sense? It's on top of it. Well, anyhow, that makes sense. Does that make sense? How Boaz? It's actually an image of Christ. Now, here's the second thing, and I love this. The second Goel, and this is supposed to be shocking, is Ruth. Usually, women are not Goels. Ruth is this first Goel. Does that make sense? A woman could be a Goel. They even say Ruth is better than 7 sons. Yes.
Are you going to go get your coffee? Because I want to know how that Goel is spelled.
Goel.
Goel before I leave. I'll look it up. I don't want to walk in front of you.
Oh, are you leaving? Do you want me to turn my back?
I want you to go get the coffee.
Yeah.
I was reading some Jewish commentary about that story, and they said that Boaz died the day after he was married, and they said it's a punishment for marrying outside that.
Yeah, but that's not in the story.
No, but that's their commentary is saying that. So,
Okay.
I don't know if it's true, yeah, but you know.
Well, I don't know what to say about that. You can say whatever you want. But St. Paul does say something. He says, and think about this. Ruth is the first woman to be a Goel. In Galatians, there's a strange part that we change in English because it might offend people. So it says, for in Christ, Jesus, you are all sons of God through faith. Well, that sounds like misogynistic. Does that make sense? What do you mean? Shouldn't it say you are all sons and daughters? So in English, when that's read in English, it's changed to say sons and daughters. But that's not what Paul meant. He meant sons. And the shocking part about that is this. In ancient times, the son inherited everything. Does that make sense? And so, like, we in America were so, anyhow, this one woman once explained it where she grew up in a third world country where the son, he was gold, and he got everything. Does that make sense? Women ate after the men, women cleaned up after the men. It's a traditional society. And yeah, I was joking. And when she heard that Christ makes us all sons, she knew what it meant because she was always treated that a woman is less. Does that make sense? If she's a son, then that means she gets to eat first. She's not the servant of anybody. Does that make sense? That's what Paul's saying. So it would have been shocking at the time to realize, wow, Ruth is better than 7 sons. Ruth is a really powerful Goel. So most immigrants leave for a better life. Remember, Ruth left for a worse life, where she'll be hated. But she's committed. Where you go, I will go. She's better than 7 sons. Anyhow, so Ruth is committed and powerful, and she's the first Goel in the Bible that's a woman. She really doesn't even care about getting a husband or wealth. She just wants to maintain her commitments. She wants to redeem the dead. So, in some ways, Ruth is an image of Christ as the Goel. Ruth puts no conditions on her loyalty. Come hell or high water, Naomi, I'm going to stick with you. Does that make any sense? Because it's not named the book of Boaz. It's named the book of Ruth. And just FYI, you know in like the Bible, when it says about Mary, blessed are you among women, when it says that, it's really a statement that Mary is, one thing it says, Mary's a Goel. Now that's pretty shocking. You say, well, where do you get that? The only times it says, blessed are you among women, is on women who were, like in the time of Judges, they were Goels. They led the army. Blessed are you among women means you're leading an army. You're a Goel. Does that make sense? So Ruth also is kind of this image of a future Mary. Does that make sense? Ruth is second Goel. The third Goel is the child of the promise. So in verses 14, 15, it says, he shall be great in Israel. They're not talking about Boaz. He's already great. The reference is that this great Goel will come from the line of Boaz and Ruth. They think it's David, but later, after David's kingdom crashes, they realize the great Goel could not have been David. It's got to be somebody else. And so later they would say, oh, the great Goel who's going to come is the Messiah. He's even greater than David and his great grandparents. The Christ will be like Ruth in that he'll leave safety and sacrifice everything for others. Like Ruth, the Christ will endure poverty and hatred because of love. Like Ruth, he'll put no conditions on his love. Like Boaz, the Christ will marry us. Like Boaz, he will cover us in his wings. Like Boaz, he will restore the dignity of our families. Like Boaz, he'll give us a homeland. Like Boaz, he'll give us his wealth. Like Boaz, he'll set us free. Anyhow, the third Goel that I really like is this child to be born, which is a prophecy of Christ. The fifth thing I like about the book of Ruth is pretty obvious, the theme of commitment. The Pew Study did this study on people of religion that, really, the main reason people drop out of religion is for lower cost commitments. Religion costs too much. Does that make sense? You have to do this and this and this. And they go for low cost forms of spiritual commitment. And no offense, like yoga or something that doesn't interfere with their lifestyle. I like Ruth because she's the opposite of Jonah. Jonah likes to proclaim himself religious, but really is not very committed to God. Ruth is the opposite. And there's this part where, in the Bible, with Joshua, where Joshua, before the Battle of Jericho, he sees this angel with a sword. And so I'm just going to read it because I love it. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw an angel standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, Are you for us or for our enemies? The angel replied, Neither. I have come as a commander of the Lord's army. Isn't that a great line? The angel is supposed to be Michael. He's not for us or against us. He's for God. So when people say that they will serve God as long as God is on their side, then they're not really loyal to God. When people say that they'll serve God as long as God helps them meet their goals, they're not a Goel. We should all be a little bit of a Goel. But people say, well, I prayed to God for a pony and I didn't get a pony, so I don't believe in God. Well, then you're really a weak person. You're using God as your servant. Ruth doesn't do that. Ruth is a story of loyalty. And I love in the beginning where it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine. And how they survived the time of the judges is people would come to the defense of others. And the book of Ruth, it's a story of what commitment to God looks like. Commitment to God looks like people that are incredibly committed and loyal. Anybody attacks you, they attack me. Does that make sense? That's Ruth. So that's my 5 reasons I love the book of Ruth. And so we'll break and ask you this question. We won't break, but what do you guys think of the book of Ruth? I love it, so. Rob?
I like the idea of the cost of discipleship. That Ruth is not following Naomi because it's cheap or easy. It's at a high cost.
He likes the loyalty one that the cost of discipleship is high. Ruth followed Naomi even though the cost is going to be high. Boaz acts as a Goel even though the cost is going to be high. So the cost of discipleship. Yeah.
went to live among the Moabites, how they were received by the Moabites.
Yeah, it doesn't say. Yeah, it doesn't say how the Moabites treated.
Because if when they came back, that she was hated because she was a Moabite. They lived there a long time,
10
so-
years. Yeah, it doesn't say, but this sounds kind of strange. Judaism is concerned about, has a law about not marrying foreigners. We have no proof that the Moabites had that law.
I like that it sets up a type that you've illustrated really well. And that the type will continue into the modern age, and that there will be a woman, unqualified, that will boost up the faith.
She likes the typology that there'll be a woman, unqualified, who will boost the faith. That would be my mother. I'm going to work my way. Anybody else? Like Rob.
Can I say one more thing?
All right, Rob. Don't embarrass your wife.
I like the whole story points to Jesus. I like the idea of Boaz and Ruth are both called Hillel, and so there's no distinction between male and female in Ruth's story. And that's kind of Jesus' message throughout the New Testament, is that there aren't these distinctions anymore. I mean, the women play just as important a role, even a more significant role in the passion than the men do. And so there's this equality between male and female. It's kind of one of the central messages of Jesus.
Well, I didn't even pick that up. But Mary's called highly favored one. So, love that. Okay, anybody else? Or moving on to. Okay, so couple things. One, on your table is future adult ed. So I don't do adult ed during Advent because of Advent.